You have to share your screen.
I am not sharing.
No. I see you're pretty
We
big.
got 27 monitors right now.
I have a Go for JS project where I'm bundling all of the assets into the JS file, like PNGs and stuff. It's crazy. That's why. It is, and it works well. You don't even have to base 64. It turns out you can just throw junk into JS files and it's really fair.
What do you do? Okay, are we live again on YouTube?
Everybody good? Happening.
Go ahead.
Hey, I'm Vince.
Hey, Vince.
I'm over CSS. I'm sure a lot of you are. My reasons might be a little different because I actually used to like it. This talks about them over CSS, aka there's no such thing as CSS architecture, aka class names hold no semantic value, aka you've been way overthinking it the entire time.
That's why you should use semantic tags.
Exactly. So this was kind of my summary of the journey. I like to give historical context, like Miguel, so I'll go into that a little more detail later. You're probably already thinking, like, this is going to involve new tools and libraries. It does. Get over it. Be happy that other people wrote 40% of your code and you still have a job.
How long is this clip?
We'll let it play out.
Can we see this out?
Wow, that's impressive.
So, that's Lady back on the liquor. I am Vince Spielman, front-end developer at TED. Also work at Bankrate, Quicken Loans, Level 11. So I've kind of done big companies, small companies, startups. I've been at agencies. I've kind of been all over the place, and this is where my experience has led me. That's my wife's favorite picture of our dog and her least favorite picture of herself. But I like it. You can follow me pretty much anywhere, GitHub, Twitter, whatever, at VinceB. Little housekeeping, whenever you see this font, which is the greatest font ever made, it's for free by the Font Bureau. It's called Input. I like it. That means you're looking at code. If you have any questions as we go through, feel free to ask, but I'm going to have some time again for questions, maybe. Miguel went for like 2 hours.
Yeah, that's right.
So we started here, where you would assign a value directly to an HTML element way back in the day. Hopefully you didn't ever have to do this. Then we went to styling tag names. They're semantic. We can like traverse the DOM and dig in and find whatever we want, and there's always a way to get the thing you want unless it's apparent, in which case there's not a way. And it got really messy because we had these selectors that were really, really specific, and we'd be fighting ourselves. We're writing rules that we're fighting against ourselves. And then we had semantic class names where we're like, oh, just describe that thing in a class name. Cool. I'm sure we've all worked on these. Bootstrap is kind of this style. And then BEM came along. The Russians invented it because they wanted to enforce strict rules. And it helped us to think of things in components, which is something as front-end developers we didn't think of a lot. We thought of like a page, and like here's new styles per page. This helped us to kind of think about components a little bit. But it also, it's kind of ugly. Like, I'm sorry. I'm really sick of this. We've created a bunch of work for ourselves. We've invented problems to solve over and over again. And every 18 months we're onto some new CSS class, naming structure, whatever. And it seems like everyone else is too. This is where I pretended to use a Google trend line to show that people don't like CSS and they like other things that are making them not have to write it anymore. This one happens to be Bootstrap, which I hate. But I think people over time have been less and less interested in CSS because they get sick of all the stuff that I just went through. So what do? We throw some buzzwords at it. How can we write fewer lines of CSS? We use functional atomic CSS, which is like a buzzword-loaded nonsense term. Anyone who's like a math person, functional programming person, like a Lisper, a Haskell person, just like hold your nose. Take a deep breath right now because it's just indulge me for a minute. I'm going to break down exactly what this phrase means in normal human being words. By functional, we mean single purpose, so it does one thing and it does it well. I lied. Idempotent. This is a math word, which I'll get to in a second, but it's not a human word. and no side effects. So it doesn't mess with anything outside of itself. It's worried about only what it's doing, and it's not going to mess with any of your other stuff. This is why people don't learn functional programming, because idempotent is a scary math word, and I just see it, I'm like, I don't even know how to say that. I had to look up the pronunciation. But the technical definition is unchanged in value following multiplication by itself. Very meta. Humans mean the same input will result in the same output every time. That's what it means. So you give it 5, it's always going to put out 10, right? Every single time, no matter any state that's outside of itself. It's a very simplified version, but it'll get the point perfectly. And also, it's going to be side effect free, and that means that it's not going to reach outside of its own scope. I have an asterisk here because some things you can do appear to influence things that are above you in CSS, so like z-indexes, absolute positioning. That stuff can feel like it has an impact on the scope outside of it, which I guess it does in a global context, but just let it go. We're talking about intent.
The only asterisk was for indefinite, not the no side effects.
He even just told you how to say it.
I had an asterisk in my notes, sorry. So atomic, what do I mean by atomic? Lots of tiny pieces composing a larger vision. So we're going to have a lot of class names that do barely anything, and then we're going to put them all together to make the thing that we want. And then CSS, our end result's always going to be a style sheet. It's always going to be style rules because we're not quite there yet in the world where we can get around it. Maybe when Houdini comes around, it'll let us do cool stuff. But for now, this is what we got to work with. We're still on the web. It's what we're going to do. You guys are like, I thought this was a JavaScript meetup. This guy's in the wrong room. I'm sick of CSS now as well. So let's move on to JavaScript world. React Shed is a component that I wrote. I wrote a CSS library that expresses these ideas. And then I was writing a lot of React, and I was like, how can I make this easier? I'm sick of writing class names. I'm sick of it. If you can't tell, I'm just over it. I'm done. So React Shed is a CSS and JS component that prescribes constraints for setting component style in a functional fashion. It's a long phrase. I'm going to show you what it means. React taught us that a view can be just a function of our properties, a function of its data. And I latched onto that and was like, oh, this makes perfect sense. I don't have to worry about state until I really need to. This works for me. So I was like, can we do that with style? Can we make style a function of properties? And of course, it would be different properties. It'd be properties that describe a UI rather than that describe data or an interface. And I kind of said, yeah, we can. We just have to curry it, and we have to make our view a function of the returned object of style. I don't know, it's something messy like that. But essentially, we can use our props to derive our style, which then will derive our view. So it's kind of messy. Let it stew, marinate. It sounds scary. So how do I install this thing? I built a library. Install it with Yarn, as good citizens do.
Yarn.
As good citizens do, you install it with Yarn. And let's set up a component and actually see how it works. I like flow, so whenever I write a component, like this tweak component over here that I just wanted to mock, I like to set up the shape of that component so we know what data we're dealing with. So here's what a flow definition could look like for this particular component. You can use prop types JavaScript or TypeScript, whatever you like. And then we want to pass it some data, and then here's how it's going to look. It looks really ugly. We just have all of our data nastily in there. Let's introduce Shed. I import it, and then I have this new primitive called Shed. I'm passing the component name, which is the actual tag that I wanted to render on the page. It works. You can pass it an instance of or another component. It can be a function, or it can be a string. The default is a div, but this looks kind of ugly, right? And you might get really sick of seeing these and being like, what kind of component is that? It's a little annoying, and when your code grows, this becomes more painful. So I wrote a Babel transform that does this, which technically is not feasible. We'd have to make Shed. We'd have to monkey patch React's elements and make Shed a property of that, and then you can't do that when you have dynamic dependencies. I guess you could, but it'd be really complicated. But I worked with a couple of our designers that also write front-end code to ask them what makes the most sense, what helps you to understand what's going on here. And this is what we came up with. So that just desugars to this. It's just a Babel transform step that's really, really simple. Cool, this isn't doing anything yet. It still looks exactly the same. Let's actually dive into a component. So we're going to create this image component. It's an image tag, but it's actually a shed tag. This component is set to an image, right? And we're going to give it some properties. I tried with shed to say what is the most terse way that I can describe a CSS property that's reliable. And I worked with a bunch of our developers at TED on this, and we kind of like shedded it out. That's where the name came from. We were like, let's get in a room and figure it out. So we tried to stick with something that would be the shortest representation possible of an actual CSS property. So D, anyone have any guess what D might be? Display, right? And then I-B is going to be inline block. Cool, right. And then what about the next one? So we're using a value here that's not valid CSS, but can we ascertain what it might be? With full 100% width, right. And then we're just passing our other properties along. So that component's done. What about its container? This image was nice and round for us, but we want to make sure any image that gets passed into it is round. BR, any ideas what it might be? Border radius. And then 1/2. Well, like that 50%, right? Cool. So in Shed, you can say these numbers in a variety of different ways. It's a 12 base scale you can use. So you can say 6 of 12. You can say 1 of 2. You can say 1, literally the word of 2. You can say 1/2, whatever you like. And then width and height. Again, we saw width. It's the same for height. And then we just gave it a number. And that's not a pixel value. It's not an M value. It's not a rem value. It's a function of the scale. You're taking that number and passing it into a scale function that comes with Shed. What does scale look like? Here's an example scale that comes out of the box. Essentially, it's what's called a modular scale. It's this like kind of pseudoscience-y notion of taking musical scales and assigning a number value to them, and then deriving different sizes based on that. I think of it as a way to create a common language with other developers and designers, where you can say, go up one level on the scale on that, and then let's see how it is. Or go down one level, rather than saying, oh, what is it right now, 14 pixels? Let's go to 12.8 pixels, and that never-ending battle where you end up with unlimited number of sizes. If you can get your team to sign off on like, cool, let's go by this, it's very flexible. There are large steps on the scale. There are some scales that have really large steps, so it might be 1 rem all the way up to 2 rems, all the way up to 3 rems, or all the way up to 4 rems, like whatever the scale may be. Or you can get really small, and you can grow these values out as high as you want. So if you needed 30 different scale values, for example, on the TED.com talk page, we use 30 different scale values.
I don't understand how this solves the problem. Can I just say like, oh, it's 1, let's go to 1.3.
No.
But you have 0.1, 0.2, 0.3.
I enforce it so you. These are down on the scale, if you'll notice. So the idea is 0 is nothing, and then like 1, it goes up from 1, and then 0.1 means like below. I don't know. It's below whatever your base value is, right? So scale takes a base value of like default to the browser's font size, which is 16 pixels, and then it calculates whatever the rems are off of that. And whenever you go below that base value, it gets a decimal in front of it. So it doesn't mean literally 1/10 of that number. Think of it as like going up or down steps rather than as it being math.
Okay.
So the idea was if you're like 0 has to be 0 for people to understand what it is. In true like modular scale fashion, a 0 would be your root value. But for people to understand like how to get to 0, 0 has to represent nothing. And then if you're programming and you say font 1, that's going to be your base value, right? 16. And if you go up, and then it might be 1.4 rems. Then you're like, okay, that's way bigger. And then your designer says, make it smaller. You're at 1 right now, just go to 0.1, and then 0.2, and then 0.3, and then 0.4.
So you never actually use scale 0.
Unless you never, well, 0 is 1. It's modulated. So these would all be, 0 would not be in this list at all.
Move on. Yeah,
Anyway,
anyway,
in your theme, when you pass it to Shed, you can name these however you want. So.
Okay, cool.
So that number actually represents 11.3 rems, scale 8, and then OH, overflow hidden, because we don't want anything to fall outside of our container. Cool, this is great, love it so far. I went through the painstaking trouble of making sure this works with like every CSS property conceivable. It works like responsively. There's like a bunch of breakpoints you can set up, etc., all without any CSS tooling, any CSS files, whatever. You can go to bensb.me/shed. It'll be in the talk notes, and see the documentation for all that stuff. Chris Coyer actually talked about on CSS tricks this week. Throwing it out there. So how does this actually work under the covers? I haven't seen any actual styles yet. We use a CSS and JS library called Emotion. Why Emotion? Emotion minimizes the runtime cost of CSS and JS dramatically by parsing your styles with post-CSS during compilation instead of at runtime. So Emotion is really great at optimizing. It's really great at being small. It's really great at getting out of your way. It's really great at, it has really great tooling. It has Babel transforms that will precompile critical CSS. It has a server component that will parse any critical CSS. It has a lot of good tools, good documentation, good test suite. I tried this with Glamorous, with styled components, and there's one other I tried it with, and Emotion is where I landed on it. I like it a lot. The big thing that is a win is the built-in server rendering thing, I think. So you can precompile a style sheet and pass that down with your page rather than having to parse it all once you load your JS. Cool, we don't really care that much, but let's see what the output looks like while we're talking about it. It just generates class names. So in your compiled JSX, once it's in the browser, it gives you a SHA and a string. You can customize the string if it makes you happy, and then it just adds those styles. It's smart about this. This is the parent container, right? See, we have this like big ugly number now that we wouldn't have wanted to write or necessarily access the variable. That was the scale value that we put in. It's really good at figuring out like, oh, these 4 components all share these styles. I'll make a class name for those and apply that class name to all those components, so you're not repeating yourself over and over again in the output, which keeps your generated code small. Emotion takes care of all the hard and annoying work, precompiling, condensing all of our code, pseudo selectors. It can do hover, it can do media queries, it can do target, all that stuff, and optimizing. It's really fast. It's my favorite CSS and JS solution out there, and it's really performant. So you can go to this URL and play around. It's like a code sandbox. It's called StackBlitz. It runs in a progressive web app service worker and compiles offline even. So you can go there and play around with Shed and try to finish that component and see if you like it. I have it all set up for you and ready to go. Anyone have questions? Yeah.
Why would you do this Babel transform instead of just using a higher order component?
Because the goal is to not have to create some sort of new primitive for every component that you want to use, right? So, let's go back.
Because then you'd have to import it?
So then, this is like a one-off, right? So I might not want to create a new higher order component that composes all of these properties every time I want to make a new component. So sometimes I just have a div that I want like a margin bottom on, and I don't want to create a new higher order component that only applies whatever that margin bottom value is. So it's either that, or in my JSX I'm actually like using React.create element and passing it a higher order component. And I think either of those things kind of defeat the purpose. You can't move quickly, so you might as well why don't you just write a new CSS class, like an actual CSS class that has those properties that are specific to that component. So I think it slows you down, number one. Number two.
I disagree. I think so. let's give an example. So if I have a higher order component that just clones the output of the children and applies these styles to it, there's no overhead. I don't have to create a new higher order component for everything. I just pass in whatever DOM element I want. And it just clones the element and applies the styles to it automatically.
So then you have to put the DOM element as the child. So then you're changing the way your hierarchy looks. I think that's
No,
best
it's
for a
cloned.
developer.
It clones it.
That's what this is doing under the hood.
Right,
Oh.
but it's so you created a
Right.
DOM, a Babel transform to do the higher order component for you, right? Yeah.
No.
Yeah. So say I have a higher order component and I just want to I have a wrapper, right? It's like connect. All you have to do is pass it in the component and it'll automatically apply the styles.
Sure, but then whenever I want to reference that component, what does it look like?
What do you mean one?
So do I have to make a new one of those for I have to make one for this avatar wrapper and then I have to make one
No.
for the
It
image?
just takes
It's
whatever.
kind of like, have you seen how JSX style works?
It looks like a
Yeah, you import like
diagram.
Flex. I mean, you don't. They have just like div, right?
This is different.
It's capital D, right?
Yeah.
Like Glamorous and all that, they have capital D, but I don't want to use those primitives. I don't think that
Well, it's kind of
developers want
actually,
to use
I think
those
it's
primitives.
closer to how styled components work, where you have you import. But see, the problem is with this, you don't have to, because it's a Babel stuff, you don't have to import shit anything. So it seems like you're saying.
syntax sugar, right?
Right,
Really,
exactly.
that's
This
all
is
it
sugaring, right?
I got a
Yeah.
question.
Yeah.
One, do you have to import shed, uppercase shed still?
Yes.
Two, does this work for any component or just lowercase?
No, it works for any.
See, that's kind of cool.
That's part of the power of, I think like I said, I think you could do it in a higher order component, but I think it simplifies it a lot if rather than passing it and cloning it, it's just Babel transform. Who really cares?
Man, more questions. Really fascinated by this, I like it. But how does it do the property names? Is there just a map of okay.
Yes, there's a map. Emotion supports either actual CSS template blocks, like a template string function that parses, or it supports actual JS objects. So I went the JS object route just to avoid needing the parser.
Oh, so that's you should have mentioned that. That's pretty cool. That's a whole different thing, because how styled, John, have you seen how styled components
Yes.
work? Yeah, because you say style.div, passes the template string, and that returns, that's your higher order component, that returns the component that you're actually using now, and then you use that and pass your regular
Right, that's
props.
the idea, that you wouldn't have to do that every time with every component that you wanted to use. It becomes transparent.
So what is the syntax like for this? You just div.shed template string?
Right, it's whatever your component is, .shed. And then these are your properties.
Mm-hmm.
Right, and it's like every CSS property. There's ones for flex and cursor and border and all that. Nonsense.
And the shorthands too. That sounds crazy. You did all that yourself? That sounds like a lot of work, man.
It
Wow.
wasn't fun. I used Vim, so it wasn't that hard.
That sounds like I don't know.
Any other questions?
What do you, as a user, what would you do if one of the CSS property names conflicts with one of the properties
The prop?
of one of the props of the actual component itself?
What do you mean?
I have a prop called width.
For the image, you had
Oh,
you see what if you have the image for some reason had a W prop?
Typically, I'll only expose those. This is me as someone using it. Our practice is to only expose those if you actually need to override the shed prop. I actually haven't run into that yet. We're proxying through props, but I guess if you had a W prop on your component and then you also wanted to assign the width and shed, that would be a problem. I haven't thought of that yet. I haven't run into it. That's good.
And others.
Not. So in the CSS library, I have some syntax that will handle that stuff. But in Shed, the way I'm doing it right now is falling back to emotions handling. So you can in any one of these components, if you want to drop down to like raw CSS but still have it treated as this compiled class name, you have a CSS property that's an object, and then you can pass in any normal CSS styles you want. So I handle cover and that kind of stuff in there. It's not great, but I don't know, I'm still thinking about it. Do you have any thoughts? Yeah.
I think it's really cool, by the way.
Thank you.
Did you like think about handling theming, or is that kind of a
Yes.
problem you were like,
I didn't show it in here, but basically it takes a theme object that takes anything that you want to give it, but there are a few special ones. Colors is a hash that's string key name, and then whatever the hex color, RGB, whatever you want to give it. And then another thing I did on colors is I set up some helpers around like alpha values, so you can say blue dot 1 and it's 10% alpha or 10% opaque, whichever one CSS chooses. I always forget and go back and forth. And then there's also one that allows you to assign fonts. So if you're using custom web fonts, loading those still sucks. You still have to do it whatever way it's happening before. And
So do you have to wrap give the app level a provider?
there's a provider, yes.
Yeah,
There's a theme
okay.
provider. It uses one that kind of all of the big CSS and JS libraries are adopting called theming. But I mean, it just passes values through. It doesn't really do very much. It just adds the context. Other questions?
Sorry, another question. It's interesting to hear about theming, because I had to go write some typing for it the other day. Somebody had me fix some typings, and I was kind of wondering, have you compared this to JSS, or did you look at that?
I looked at JSS. I looked at JSX styles, is the one you mentioned, because Next uses that one by default, right? I looked at Aphrodite, and I looked at there's one that's like named after a robot or something, Styletron. And initially I went with styled components because I was like, oh, it's just like CSS and all the front end devs will like this, and then everyone was like, we don't really care actually. So the thing that led me to Emotion is like all the tooling he had set up for like server rendering, for extracting out critical CSS, like all that kind of stuff was just done and it was correct, and it was like I liked it a lot, so it was the path of least resistance, I think, with the most features.
Does this generate like a CSS file that you like or use with the current?
You have the option of adding a babel transform that will do that. You can also add a babel transform that will only inject what it perceives as critical styles into your head, or you can generate all of the style rules using the CSS object model on the fly.
So Emotion by default will just do the CSS stop to get it all.
Correct.
One thing, so we're in the middle of this right now, trying to figure out. By the way, this is fantastic. It's really cool to see. From where I'm sitting, a huge hurdle is migrating the many tens of thousands of CSS lines, most of which I suspect is no longer used, and just bringing that into the module in line to be cozy with the components is something we're super excited to do. But it's a huge cost. It's a huge jump to us.
Yeah.
To be able, so that's why I've been looking deeply into this stuff lately, and I'm kind of settled on style components, but it's for the reason of it's the easiest interop to take the existing CSS. We're using stylus, but it doesn't matter. We're taking the existing CSS and move it into the module, and everything will still mostly work the way that it did before.
Mm-hmm.
And so then, yeah.
So with Emotion, you can certainly do that just as effectively as you could with style components.
Yeah.
I might argue even more because it supports out of the box composes the post CSS modules composes things, so you could pass in a class name that's something that exists already that you want to bring into that component. It also supports any other post CSS transforms, which is nice if you're fighting some old decrepit CSS and you're like, this is the new stuff. We're going this way, but I need for right now for me to override everything. So make these all important. You can do that. There's post CSS transforms that'll let you do just about anything, and you can bring those into Emotion and use them with Shed. And then if you're not doing CSS and JS yet, but you think this idea is interesting, there's Shed CSS, the actual CSS version. We're using it on TED.com on our new talk page. It's pretty proven and it's worked really, really well for us for solving a lot of those problems.
So if we adopt this, then you're saying I can call you for support?
Yeah.
Okay. I might take your
140 an hour.
That's all you get to.
Anything else?
Just
Anybody
a
else?
donation, right?
Yeah.
All right, thanks.
Okay.
Thanks, everyone.
Man, I really like the style of that presentation. That was good.
Thank you.
Yeah, good timing.